On another fateful day, I was with my father at a warehouse in West Memphis, Arkansas. My father and the warehouse manager were counting cartons of clothespins. It was summertime. Over the hum of the big fans built into the walls, I could hear what sounded like jungle drums from a Tarzan movie. I followed the pounding up the wooden stairs to an office. Painted on the glass door was a lightning bolt in red letters, KWEM, radio. The door was open. 4 Negro men in sun-bleached work clothes were playing music. One man, bigger than the others, were growling words I could not understand into a silver microphone. I watched until my father found me. Outside in the parking lot, I snapped on the car radio and searched until I found the strange music I'd seen in the warehouse. The announcer said, "You've been listening to the Howlin' Wolf." The music stuck in my head. I had an older friend with a 78 RPM copy of Wolf, so I Got a Woman on Chess Records. I listened to it over and over. Then one day in Reuben Cherry's Home of the Blues record shop on Beale Street, I found a Chess record with a gray album cover with the drawing of a lone wolf howling at the moon. I took it to the checkout counter, and Reuben said, "Boy, you got the blues there. Heed the call of the wolf, the haunted cry of an animal alone in the night. His voice makes a room rumble with echo that seems to hang in the air. His singing so strong that between the vocal lives the sound of the drums and the French harps sucked up into the mix. Notes blend together and merge into a melody line, not being played by one instrument alone. He is a primitive modernist, using chords and modal harmonies of a dark ritual past, brought up from Mother Africa and slavery through an electric amplifier." Howlin' Wolf led me to Muddy Waters and John Lee Hooker, then Jimmy Reed. I started to discover a pattern repeating within their songs, a chord progression of lines and patterns. It seemed learnable in a way that my mother's piano sheet music did not. The disc jockeys on WDIA and WLOK, Rufus Thomas, Miss Norma Jean, Moo-Ha, and Honey Boy, they were my new teachers. When Alex saw that I wanted to play music, he wanted to help. While he was a great singer and always sang while he worked, he could play no instrument. On Saturday mornings when he came by to wash my father's company car and get paid for the week, he brought me piano teachers. The first guy was named Butterfly. He was the stepson of the man who owned the George Washington Broad Street Cafe where Alec hung out and where Frankie Lane had tipped a cop car over by hand. Butterfly had just gotten off the penal farm, was in jail. And his heavily processed hair was shaved clean an inch above his ears. Alex explained that he had to pay off the barber to save at least the top of his rooster tail hairdo. I watched as his huge hands danced over my mother's piano keys. He played 3 o'clock in the morning, one of Alex's favorites, and he tried to show me the blues scale with the flatted 3rd and 7th, and I didn't get it. But the second teacher Alec brought me was better. Alec called him Piano Red, which seemed to make him mad. He was not Piano Red. I knew that and tried to look sympathetic. He was older, hunched over, wearing an old gray overcoat and snap brim. He was obviously drunk. He sat down at the piano and coughed deep in his chest. "What'd you want to hear?" he grumbled. I asked if he knew "Come On Down to My House," the song I heard the jug band play in Whiskey Shoot. He laughed and said, "How did you know that song? Man, that song is older than your daddy." He played through the melody once and spoke solemnly to me. "I'm going to show you something. Pay attention to this. Everything in music is made up of codes." "What? Codes? Secret codes? Just like Captain Midnight?" No wonder I couldn't understand it. Music is in codes. Why didn't my mother tell me that? "This is how you make a code. You take one note, any note, and you go up 3, down 4, just like in poker. 3 up and 4 down, and you got a code." Of course, he meant chord. It works anywhere on the piano. Not steps and half steps like the music teacher told me, but keys on the keyboard. 3 notes up and 4 notes down, and you have a major triad, tonic root note on the bottom, first inversion. That was it, the information I needed to know. With a triad on top and an octave on the bottom, that could open into a boogie-woogie pattern and the blues scale. Apply to that appropriate rhythm and syncopation, and you are playing rock and roll piano, pal. So I learned the secret of music from the Phantom, still unknown to me by any other name until one afternoon years later. I was in the Melody Music store just hanging out. It was raining, and out of the storm in stepped the Phantom. He took off ragged work gloves and shoved them in his overcoat pocket and ran his hands over one of the keyboards in the showroom floor stock. I was afraid the owner would run him off, but it didn't happen. He played Sophisticated Lady without sitting down. He saw me watching and stopped. He looked up. "Come on down to my house," he mumbled in recognition. "Thanks for what you showed me," I said, trying to think of something better. He shrugged, waved his hand goodbye, and shuffled back into the rainy afternoon. Ferguson, the old guy who did the maintenance on band instruments back in the workshop, came over to me and said, "Man, how do you know that old man? That was Dish Rag. He used to be somebody. That was Dish Rag." It's hard, if not impossible, to describe Dewey Phillips. If he is known at all, it is as the Memphis disc jockey who first played Elvis Presley on the radio. He is little known as the man who brought to life the idea that was Elvis. The same year that we had moved to Memphis, 1949, Sam Phillips had come to town from Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and Dewey Phillips, a brother of the soul, not the flesh, had lost his job selling sheet music in a dime store and started broadcasting a nighttime music program on WHBQ radio. He'd play Hank Williams, Your Cheating Heart, and then Sister Rosetta Thorpe's Strange Things Happening Every Day, or Otis Williams and the Charms' Tell Me Why You Like Roosevelt. No rules or restrictions. Yet there was a sameness, a texture to the songs he chose, a place to the sounds and voices. There was the idea, the black-white crossover that became not just Elvis, but defined the Memphis sound, the real deal, the mother lode. This was the golden age. Divided for centuries by race and property rights, two cultures were reaching for each other to musically embrace. The collision of racial cultures that the geographical and political polarity made inevitable. The threat of communism and nuclear holocaust put the big squeeze on the American dream. TV made the global village smaller and bigger at the same time. The 50s held the promise of prosperity. This new music represented the triumphs of the individual human spirit and grew to symbolize freedom to the world. Dewey Phillips was the MC, the stage manager, the ringmaster of the music that would change the world. In 1957, before guitar players were a dime a dozen and you could learn how to play like Chuck Berry at your local music store, you taught yourself. I still maintain that rock and roll should be self-taught. That's what he told me. There is a guitar pattern that starts with Jimmy Reed, who uses it as a recurrent theme throughout his entire repertoire. It's played by 2, sometimes 3 guitar players, a lead and a rhythm. Chuck Berry takes the same 3 notes from a basic boogie-woogie bass line and makes them into the rhythm guitar part that was the hard drive of rock and roll, which led to the 8th note frenzy of punk rock. This same riff, with yet again a slightly different groove and backbeat feel, is present over and over in Hank Ballard and the Midnighters, which is without question one of the best group names in the history of rock and roll. The Midnighters, dark and mysterious, the wee, wee hours, the rising of the moon, a time when all good people were fast asleep, surely not dancing to the forbidden Negro bebop. My band played them all. We called ourselves the Regents, but everybody called us the Jim Dickinson combo. We had a reputation for being wild and loud. Our guitar player was the first guitarist in Memphis who could play a Chuck Berry solo. We played the Sun catalog, but we also played Bo Diddley, Howlin' Wolf, and Jimmy Reed years before it was popular to do so. So when Bo Diddley comes to town, my band opens up the show. High school football season was over, and the cold of winter was in the air. You could feel it. This was the big party of the fall. Something screamed from far away, "This is it! This is the night, the great wake for the summer. The big beast coming to rest tonight." My band was opening up for Bo Diddley. Bo Diddley had caused a riot the night before in Nashville. A girl had jumped on stage and started to dance. The girl was white, thus the problem. The story had run in the Memphis paper and the frat boy promoters were starting to sweat it. Bo Diddley has not showed up. My band was contracted to play 1 set. We agreed to keep playing. It got later and later. We stretched it out. The audience was getting crazy. Finally we got the word Bo Diddley had arrived. We stopped playing and went out the back door where 2 Chrysler station wagons had pulled up and parked on the sidewalk. They were covered with randomly placed pinstripe hot rod decals and a hand-lettered sign that said Bo Diddley Band. 2 giant men in thick fur coats were driving. The 3-piece band was unloading their drum kit. Bo Diddley was arguing with the frat boy promoter when my band and I walked up. The frat boy was shaking what was obviously a performance contract and screaming, "It says right here you're playing 2 one-hour sets and taking 1 break." He is irate and overly agitated. Slowly, Bo Diddley reaches in his pants pocket and pulls out a wadded up, greasy piece of paper and unfolds it. Sure enough, it is a contract. "Yeah," he says, "this says that in my contract too." He wads it up and puts it back in his pants. He points at me, and he could have been Bo Diddley. He points at my guitar player, or he could have been Bo Diddley. He continued, "But I is Bo Diddley, and Bo Diddley is taking 3 breaks." That was it. I agreed to play the breaks for an extra $150, and the proceedings began to commence. The hour struck, and the witch man, great raiser of the dead, had arrived. He had an amplifier that looked like an icebox laying down an orange guitar shaped like a Fairline Ford. The trio was wearing knee-length red coats. Bo turned on the amp and tuned his guitar at full volume. The crowd screamed. Bo laughed and laughed and just kept tuning. Then he started, drums laying down a repeated pounding rhythm, maracas filling up the holes. Over and over the jungle sound filled the armory, swelling. The world stood on its head and screamed. No one was exactly dancing. The crowd moved like one giant sheet on a pedestal 10 feet over the crowd's heads. The madmen were rain dancing. The night stopped being pink and became flaming green, and everything in it was orange, like merthiolate spilled in a bathtub. Some of the football disciples down front who had 6-pack beer cartons on their heads were whooping the Indian dance, hearing the organ grinder and hearing the mating call. Watching the great god with the orange scepter screaming, "Sugar, sugar," he jumped down my throat and started running around inside me. The drum screamed. The giant swelling guitar tore the night into little nights and blew them away to the red stars. This was the dying time. This was the end of the beginning. Air alive with calls and moans, never-ending sun, orange and green, monolithic star of the day. Watching his hands was a mystery. He was not making recognizable chords. He seemed to play a pattern first open and then closing his hand for the 4 chord. He zoomed his hand up the neck, making a low bass string scream and rumble. I looked around and Ricky, one of the guitar players in my band, was watching him too. I could see in his eyes that he was trying to figure it out. After the dance, I went over to Ricky's. We worked in his music room until dawn, by which time we had figured out open D tuning. Bo Diddley had his guitar tuned to an open chord. We had broken the code of the black man's magic technique, which opened up a new world of soul, funk, and country blues. Then, wild-eyed, still possessed by the witch man, I was in bed and away on a gray sleeping cloud, listening to the music in my head. The golden era was brief. Elvis went to Hollywood and in the Army. Dewey Phillips was kicked off the air. Jerry Lee Lewis married his cousin. Chuck Berry went to prison. The bottom dropped out of the rock and roll dream. But the blues changed color in the 50s, became rock and roll, and was rediscovered by a new generation in the 60s, and infused with a jolt of fresh life energy from the international youth culture. Although diluted, diffused, and sometimes misdirected, the blues have survived. Something happens when white boys play the blues, rock and roll, whether it's Elvis, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, or the Beastie Boys. It is a complicated process of push and pull from both sides of an ever-changing line in the sand. Each time the line is crossed, it blurs and becomes less important. This mutant musical form traces the history of one of the most significant changes in the social fabric of the Western world in the 20th century. This music has come to symbolize freedom the world over and to illustrate the interracial brotherhood of man. World Boogie is coming. James Luther Dickinson. Thank you. Thank you, Alan Young. Thank you. God bless you guys.